Welcome back to Why Hell Isn't Really Real, Part 3. Still in the Old Testament, entering Psalms. Again, just covering the word Sheol, which is where we get the word hell, which is the word meaning covering or helmet. We've gone over that. In the last video, I was cut off when I was talking about how different words can be used for similar concepts. So, for example, the Hebrews had 12 different words for love, okay, because there's different kinds of love. Even in English, we have different words for death, which, as we go into Psalms, it can get confusing when we're talking about the grave being the primary interpretation of the word Sheol, because Sheol means to cover, right? So mystery, covering, helmet. It can be a pit, it can be earth or dirt, because it all comes from that common concept that this is to be buried, okay? Now, when we use words like maveth, which I might not be pronouncing completely correctly, it means a violent death. So when we say death, murder, you know, and these types of words in our language, we have different language to describe different things. So maveth is a word that is exclusive to a violent type of death, okay? Doesn't have to do with being buried, doesn't have to do with the grave, even though the grave obviously goes hand in hand with a violent death. So there are several different words within Psalms that have similar meanings within the same passages. And as I wrote this out a few years ago, I tried to incorporate those words just to prevent confusion. I'm not sure how much I'm going to hit on that as I go through this, but I wanted to make sure that I prefaced that. That there's going to be a couple of other words that I'm throwing in here besides Sheol, just for general education and just to make sure that we're keeping things in context. Okay? So example 20 is where we're at, and it's Psalms 9:13 through 20, keeping in mind that we have not yet had a mention of afterlife anywhere in Scripture. Remember, the tree of life was meant to allow mankind to continue to live on earth. When the plan of salvation was given in the garden, it did not discuss anything in regards to afterlife, although it did hint at resurrection, as long as we keep resurrection in context so that we don't start missing passages about resurrection thinking that they're passages about other things, okay, without going way too far down that road. So Psalm 9:13 through 20. Have mercy upon me, O Lord. Consider my trouble which I suffer of them that hate me. Thou that liftest me up from the gates of death. Okay? That I may show forth all thy praise in the gates of the daughter of Zion. I will rejoice in thy salvation. The heathen are sunk down into the pit that they made. In the net which they hid is their own foot taken. The Lord is known by the judgment which he executeth. The wicked is snared in the works of his own hands. The wicked shall be turned into Sheol, and all the nations that forget God. For the needy shall not always be forgotten. The expectation of the poor shall not perish forever. Arise, O Lord, let no man prevail. Let the heathen be judged in thy sight. Put them in fear, O Lord, that the nations may know themselves to be but men. Okay? So the entirety of this is wrapped up in that last verse. Okay? Put them in fear, O Lord, that the nations may know themselves to be but men. So essentially saying, remind them that they're mortal. Remind them that they're just men, that they can die. Okay? This whole passage is dealing with the wicked. Okay? And when we talk about, dictators, tyrants, enemies, we may talk more about death, that death is what needs to happen in a war situation or in a situation where excessive lives are being taken. And what we have here is he's crying out for judgment, and that judgment that he's crying out for is death. The judgment that he's talking about is wrapped up in, again, death, the pit, and the grave. Okay? So the wicked shall be turned into the grave. The wicked shall be turned into the ground. They'll be sent into the ground. So again, we don't have any, even if we were to pull hell out of that, and Psalms is a lot more language oriented with a lot of our preconceived notions about hell in regards to its excessive focus on the wicked, its excessive focus on evil, its excessive focus on judging those, bringing justice. So there's going to be a lot of talk about death. And Proverbs and Psalms are probably the two where if we have those preconceived notions, we're going to hear a lot more of what we believe is hell. But again, we have no teaching about it. So if we were to read in our own interpretation of hell, then we are extra biblical in that regard. Okay? And I'm not saying that you can't believe in hell. I'm just saying that based on this study, unless new information can be brought to the table, then we need to admit that we believe in an extra biblical Greek concept, because everything that we believe about hell came from the god Hades. And then it loosely got attached back to scriptures like what we've discussed before. So where it talks about worms eating a body in the grave, which is natural, and we can observe that. Like, if somebody dies, they're going to be eaten by worms in the earth, okay? But we have passages talking about that, using the word Sheol, and people with a preconceived notion will see worms. They already believe in this Hades concept, so they will say in afterlife, in this place of all these things that have been added that have to do with Hades, because we start describing his world, and then we add worms to it, okay? But we have zero teaching on that in the canon of Scripture. Now, some would argue that the Jews believed in it because of missing books. We have not read those missing books, so that is, again, extra biblical revelation. If you want to go that route, you can. But we need to treat that the same as we would treat anything else that we would make an assumption about that is outside of Scripture and found in heathen, pagan nations in history. Okay? So if the Greeks preserved this teaching and the Jewish nation did not preserve this teaching, then it is a leap for sure to start saying it's true based on absolutely no evidence of it being true. So, example 22, Psalm 18:5, I will call upon the Lord who's worthy to be praised. So shall I be saved from my enemies. The sorrows of death compassed me, and the floods of ungodly men made me afraid. The sorrows of Sheol compassed me about, the snares of death prevented me. So, embedded in an entire passage about death, we have the word Sheol. Okay? So the sorrows of Sheol compassed me about. So the sorrows of the grave surrounded me. Again, without a preconceived idea, there is no way you can pull Hades out of that. So example 23. O Lord, thou hast brought up my soul from Sheol. Thou hast kept me alive, that I should not go down to the pit. So, again, I won't go down to the pit. Like, you brought my soul up from the grave. You kept me alive, that I would not go down to the pit. It does not read correctly to say, thou hast brought up my soul from Hades, from afterlife, from a place that, according to our mainstream teaching, you can never return from. Not to mention the psalmist has never been to that place Hades rules in the Greek world, okay? Um, there is no teaching here about David or whoever the psalmist, whoever you believe this psalmist to be, has gone into an afterworld controlled by a demon where there is fire and worms and everything else, okay? Now, I get that we're going to look at Jesus in the future and realize that this is a prophecy as well about Jesus going into the grave and getting the keys, okay? And right there, you may stop and choke a little bit thinking, well, that proves the whole point that there is a hell, okay? Because we haven't touched on those New Testament concepts yet. Because we're going in order, because I'm showing you that there is no teaching about this yet. So, I get that that's difficult. I get that that's hard. I get that you're probably choking on that right now because I just referenced something way in the future from where the passages that we're reading. And it makes us feel like we have justification for believing something that was never taught in the Old Testament. Okay? Because we think that it's reflected in the New Testament, that must validate it being taught in the Old Testament. And we will get into what those passages mean, but we need to stay here for now. Okay? So example 24. Let me not be ashamed, O Lord, for I called upon you. Let the wicked be ashamed, and let them be silent in Sheol. Okay? So, let them be silent. Let them be silent in the grave. We know blood cries out from the ground, right? Abel's blood cried out from the ground, from the dust, okay? From the grave. Again, same concept. So, let them be silent. Let their blood not cry out. Let them be just forgotten in the grave. Example 25 and 26, Psalm 49, 14 through 15. Like sheep, they are laid in Sheol. Okay? So sheep, dead, and sheep obviously don't go to an afterlife where it represents Hades concept, okay? Like the sheep, they are laid in the grave. So, like the sheep die, people die, okay? Death shall feed on them, right? That's the worms, okay? The upright shall have dominion over them in the morning, and their beauty shall consume in Sheol from their dwelling. Okay, so that's again worms eating that beauty, worms eating that flesh. That flesh is corruptible. But God will redeem my soul from the power of Sheol, and he shall receive me. So the power of death, the power of the grave, that is where he's saying God's going to redeem my soul from the power of the covered place, the dirt covering me, or the grave, or the worms eating me, or corruptible flesh. And these are messianic prophecies about Jesus being incorruptible flesh, and this is where I said Psalms is going to get trickier, because our preconceived notions are going to play tricks with our brain to make us think this is talking about something we've already assumed from a future passage. Okay? But this is a prophecy of the Messiah coming, and because of these prophecies, because of this poetic and prophetic language, it is going to be harder if we already have a preconceived notion. But if we don't have a preconceived notion, it reads very easily when we continue to use the word that's been used throughout the Old Testament, which is the word grave, okay? For lack of a better term, it literally means covered, firm covering, you know. So grave is how that continues to get interpreted, because with graves you are covered in dirt, okay? Example 27, Psalms 55, 13 through 23. But it was thou, a man, mine equal, my guide, and my acquaintance. We took sweet counsel together. We walked into the house of God in company. Let death seize upon them, and let them go down quick into Sheol. For wickedness is in their dwellings and among them. As for me, I will call upon God, and the Lord shall save me. Evening and morning and at noon I will pray and cry aloud, and he shall hear my voice. He hath delivered my soul in peace from the battle that was against me, for there were many with me. God shall hear and afflict them, even he that abideth of old. because they have no changes before they fear not God. Therefore they fear not God. He hath put forth his hands against such as be at peace with him. He hath broken his covenant. The words of his mouth were smoother than butter, but war was in his heart. His words were softer than oil, yet they were drawn swords. Cast thy burden upon the Lord, and he shall sustain thee. He shall never suffer the righteous to be moved. But thou, O God, shalt bring them down into the pit of destruction. Bloody and deceitful men shall not live out half their days, but I will trust in thee. So, bloody and deceitful men will not live out half their days, but I will trust in you. So, they will not live out their full life. That is what's being described here. Your life will be cut in half. So, again, not a hell passage. We're talking about the grave. We're talking about an early grave, without going too deep. Psalm 86, 12 through 17. This is example 28. I will praise thee, O Lord my God, with all my heart, and I will glorify thy name forevermore. For great is thy mercy towards me, and thou hast delivered my soul from the lowest Sheol. O God, the proud are risen against me, and the assemblies of violent men have sought after my soul, and have not set thee before them. But thou, O Lord, art a God full of compassion and gracious, long-suffering, and plenteous in mercy and truth. O turn unto me and have mercy upon me. Give thy strength unto thy servant, and save the son of thine handmaid. Shew me a token for good, that they which hate me may see it and be ashamed, because thou, Lord, hast holpen me and comforted me. So again, being saved from evil and violent men, for being saved from the grave, for living when it was the expectation that you were going to die, that this whole display is made in front of wicked men. This is not about Hades. Example 29, Psalms 88:3. For my soul is full of troubles, and my life draweth nigh unto Sheol. Again, repetitive. My life draweth nigh unto hell, Hades, or the grave? The grave. Okay? Example 30. Psalm 89:48. What man is he that liveth and shall not see death? Shall he deliver his soul from the hand of Sheol? So, what man is alive that is not going to, at one point, die? Is what that first sentence says. You know, who among us is not going to eventually die? It is the expectation, the exception, that every man, woman, and child at some point in their life will die. So it asks then, will they be able to deliver their own soul from the hands of the grave? And it doesn't read as well to say, will they be able to deliver their own soul from hell? Because nothing was even described here to say that this was about only people that would go to one place or the other. It was what man that is alive, all of mankind, everyone living is going to eventually die. So not everyone living is going to go to Hades, right? So when we're talking about everyone, which we are in this passage, and we use the word Sheol, we're saying they won't be able to deliver themselves from the grave, okay? Example 31, Psalm 116, 1 through 9. I love the Lord because he hath heard my voice and my supplications, because he hath inclined his ear unto me. Therefore I will call upon him as long as I live. The sorrows of death compassed me, the pains of Sheol got hold upon me. I found trouble and sorrow. Then called I upon the name of the Lord. O Lord, I beseech thee, deliver my soul. Gracious is the Lord and righteous, yea, our God is merciful. The Lord preserveth the simple. I was brought low, and he helped me. Return unto thy rest, O my soul, for the Lord hath dealt bountifully with thee. For thou hast delivered my soul from death, mine eyes from tears, and my feet from falling. I will walk before the Lord in the land of the living. Okay, so again, the sorrows of death, the mortal experience, the acknowledgement that death will come, and the knowledge that God can save us from death, although ultimately we're still going to die at some point. So he delivered the soul from death, the eyes from tears, and the feet from falling. And therefore, the psalmist says, I'll walk before the Lord in the land of the living. So he's going to continue living because he's not going to the grave yet. Okay? Example 32, Psalm 139, 7 through 13. Whither shall I go from thy spirit, or whither shall I flee from thy presence? If I ascend to heaven, you're there. If I make my bed in Sheol, behold, you're there. If I take the wings of the morning and dwell in the uttermost parts of the sea, even there shall thy hand lead me, and thy right hand shall hold me. If I say, surely the darkness shall cover me, even the night shall be light about me. Yea, the darkness hideth not from you, but the night shines as the day, the darkness and the light are both alike to thee. For thou hast possessed my reins, thou hast covered me in my mother's womb. Okay? Talking about a lot of things in the earth here. We're talking about going into the heavens, up, or into the grave, down. Okay? Going to the right, I guess, as far as taking wings into the sea, we have geographical movement here, okay? It was very similar to when Job is saying, if I go up, if I go down, if I go right, if I go left, like, you're going to find me, you're going to be there, you're going to know it, and I can't hide from you. I can't hide in the darkness, I can't hide in the light, can't hide in the depths of the sea, can't hide in the heights of the air, can't hide in the grave. Like, there's nowhere that I can go to escape your presence, okay? But there is nothing explicit here that identifies an afterlife place where David would be saying, if I go somewhere, first of all, you can't based on all of our teachings about this, you can't will yourself to go to Hades, right? So you can't go to Hades to hide from God. God is going to know where you are in the earth at any time. But afterlife, we could maybe say some similar things, but nothing here is really pointing to afterlife unless we say that's hell. And that is a reach because there's nothing in this that really indicates that, and it reads very smoothly when we use the word grave, right? Example 33, Psalm 141:7. Our bones are scattered at the Sheol mouth, as when one cutteth and cleaveth wood upon the earth. So very morbid picture. Our bones are scattered at the mouth of Sheol. Okay. Now we know that we haven't had any teaching on what Hades is or what hell is, right? Unless we took that Deuteronomy passage and tried to put something together with that. In which case, maybe we could say there's a mouth to it or an opening to it. But bones in front of it, that's weird, right? Because the classic teaching is that it would be regenerative skin, that it would be worms eating you alive in afterlife, or the other teaching that you would be just screaming out in your addictions or the things that you couldn't let go of, or crying out for the presence of God because you just can't get there. But where do bones come from if everything here is immortal and everything is regenerative flesh and everything is resurrected and death no longer exists, right? Because death would be jumping way ahead to say death is defeated and swallowed and, thrown in the lake of fire, all that kind of stuff. But and I know you're choking on that too, because again, we're moving towards those passages. But nothing here is about afterlife, and with all of those passages and the way that we normally would teach Hades or hell, it doesn't really work to have a boneyard in front of it, okay? But if we're talking about the grave, and especially when we're talking about tombs of kings and all this kind of stuff, bones laid out in front of it, that makes sense. And the way it's described here is very morbid. So the bones are not just scattered, but they're scattered as though somebody cutteth and cleaveth wood. And it also says upon the earth. So nothing here at all is talking about afterlife, okay? So example 34, Proverbs 1:12. Let us swallow them up alive as Sheol, and whole as those that go down into the pit. So again, we're still talking about earth swallowing up alive as those that go down to the pit. So, as those that go down dead, let it so be to those who are alive. Okay? Let the earth clave asunder, pull them down, close up upon the living. Okay? It's a grave, but it's a grave. It's being buried alive. All right? And that's just going right back to that passage we already covered in part 1, where that happened with the sons of Korah. So, example 35. Proverbs 5, 4 through 5. I'm trying to go a little bit faster, and I hope that I'm still adequately and thoroughly covering this, but this is ultimately meant for you to pause, research for yourself, and get your own understanding, okay? So, example 35, Proverbs 5, 4 through 5. But her end is bitter as wormwood, sharp as a two-edged sword. Her feet go down to death, her steps take hold on Sheol, okay? So, her feet go down to death. That one is Maveth, okay, which is a violent death. Like, and this is talking about basically an adulterous woman, right? So, like, she's sleeping with these men and enraging her husband and enraging other people, and ultimately, this is going to cause death to you, right? So it's kind of like David and Uriah, except let's say Uriah wasn't killed, and now David is in danger because Uriah's wife is pregnant with his child. Okay? It's like that. So it's saying, not to mention we also have the whole stoning aspect of it in the law. Okay? And that also plays into this. But her feet go down to a violent death. Her steps take hold on the grave. So basically, like, she is just rooted in death, right? Adultery is being equated to death. It is being equated to a violent death. It's being equated to a horrific death. Like, it is not pleasant. It is not good. The advice being given here is that an adulterous woman is somebody who is going to destroy you in so many different ways while destroying herself. Okay, so example 36, Proverbs 7:27, for she hath cast down many wounded. Yea, many strong men have been slain by her. Her house is the way to Sheol, the grave, going down to the chambers of death, which again is Maveth, which means a violent death. So she's already cast down many wounded. Many strong men have been slain by her. Her house is on the way to the grave, going down to the chambers of violent death. You know, these words apply to today, you know. And this is wisdom, the wisdom of the kings, right? And in an ancient world, there's probably places we could find that could be improved upon in our more civilized world, or ever civilized, or progressing towards civilization world. But it reads well with death. It does not read well with hell. And if it were talking about hell, it would be talking about an extra biblical concept. Again, I'm being repetitive because we haven't had any clear teaching about what hell is. There's no word for it, right? We've been using the same word throughout this entire study, which is Sheol, which is why every interpretation has different passages interpreted as hell, and none of them are even remotely close to the same, including several translations where the word hell is not in it at all. And they just use the word grave for all of this because that's what it means. There is no indicator. There's no extra word. There's no extra character that would indicate, oh, this isn't the grave anymore. Now it's this afterlife. It's just not, you know, and the Jews don't have a word for hell because it was never taught. There's nothing in their language for it. You can find it in a lexicon today, the same way as if you were going to look at our language, you would find hot could mean seductive, or cool could mean awesome, you know, but those aren't what those words originally meant. But because we've incorporated new things over time, now, since the 80s or so, 70s, we have some words that mean things that they didn't originally mean because we've adapted our language, okay? So lexicons will at times point you back to that, but they will not be able to tell you when a certain word does mean afterlife and when it means the grave, okay? Because the original interpretation, just like cool was an interpretation for temperature and hot was a language for temperature, this was originally a word for the grave, okay? It was never intended to be a word used for different concepts. So, example 38, and we're well into Proverbs now, still no teaching, still no warning. Proverbs 15:10 through 11, correction is grievous unto him that forsaketh the way, and he that hateth reproof shall die. Okay? This particular word means to be put to death, okay, like a sentence. Sheol and destruction, which the word destruction here is Abaddon, which means ruins, okay, are before the Lord. How much more then the hearts of the children of men? So Sheol and ruins, Sheol and destruction. So the grave and ruins, right? We just talked about the boneyard, right? We're talking about ruins. We're talking about destruction. We're talking about death. We're talking about the grave. So this is all about death. Nothing about sulfur, fire, brimstone, worms, pitchforks, violins and fiddles or goatees and horns. We don't get any of that stuff here, okay? And we have gotten rid of a lot of those concepts. We would laugh to think that there's a literal, red skin, horned, fiddle playing, goatee wearing, devil with a pitchfork. And hoofed feet. Like, we have completely abandoned that, which came from, I think, Wicca. It came from, pagan Gaia, Mother Earth types of concepts, and we got that imagery from that, and then tied it back to what we thought the Bible was saying when we thought the Bible was saying Hades or hell. And when we've gotten rid of some of those concepts, like the red skin, the pitchfork, the horns, the cleft feet, the fiddle, the goatee, we've abandoned some, but we still have a ways to go to abandon the rest, okay? Because these are add-ons. These are things that were added when indulgences were being sold, okay? And it was used to manipulate people, and it was meant to convert people through fear. So Proverbs 23, example 40, withhold not correction from the child, for if thou beatest him with the rod, he shall not die. The word is muth, if I'm pronouncing that right, which means to die prematurely. Okay, thou shalt beat him with the rod, and thou shalt deliver, meaning rescue, his soul from Sheol. So again, a lot of misinterpretations come out of this that even go into child abuse. I'm trying to keep this focused on our Hades hell teaching. Obviously, being a child is wrong. That's not what this is talking about. You have to break down every word in this passage to really realize that this is not saying beat your child, and there are so many passages that say you should not beat your child. However, this is saying to correct a child, and if you do it correctly, then you're going to rescue them from a premature death, which is where the word Sheol in this passage means the grave. So example 41. Proverbs 27. As in water, face answereth to face, so the heart of man to man. Sheol and destruction are never full. Okay? And we've already been hitting on death and destruction, or the grave and destruction, or the grave and ruins. So the eyes of man are never satisfied. As the refining pot for silver and the furnace for gold, so is a man to his praise. Remember this silver and gold. We're going to come back to this when we get all the way to Revelation. Okay? So the reference here is a purifying fire. Okay? And God, as we know, is a refining fire. Okay? He is not a tormenting fire. He's a refining fire. God is a consuming fire. Okay? But that fire is meant to refine, it's meant to purify, it's meant to be fuller soap. All growth, all process is painful like fire, right? Now, there is a slow burn that we can endure, right, as we grow. But my theory, and this is my theory about afterlife, okay, and it's the closest I can get from Scripture, but Scripture just does not talk very much about afterlife. My theory, and I have some passages to back this up, and I may get into them before we wrap up this series, is that we have an opportunity to turn towards that refining fire in this life. We were talking about the law and karma, and how grace can enter the picture to satisfy the eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth, but where, taking 2 eyes for 1 eye is now excessive and unjust. Hell would be unjust because God punishes according to the crime and nothing more, okay? And I know we have a mysterious God and all this stuff that people try to use to justify him being ununderstandable and unjust. Well, his ways are not ours. He's perfect. He can execute judgment. We can't. All these types of things that people say that they aren't pulling out of Scripture, okay? They're just pulling it out of the need to hold on to this belief. And I get it. God can do some things outside of our perspective, right? And we can go there, but again, we're going extra biblical if we go there. So, example 20, we're now in Isaiah with no teaching on hell ever in the Old Testament. And we haven't used a different word than Sheol to describe it. Because we've only had the word Sheol talking about the grave. And where it was interpreted to the word hell was inconsistent from variation to variation to variation for those who think that I just misspoke and tripped myself up or checkmated myself or whatever. I've heard it all. But the teaching isn't there, okay? One word has been used. That word does not mean hell. And in context, we haven't found a single place where it means hell. And we definitely haven't found a warning about hell in regards to afterlife. We have not found a reference to it in the law. We haven't had a reference to it in the flood. We haven't had a reference to it in any of the punishments that have happened. And if any of these are correctly interpreted to the word hell, which would be so weird to, by private interpretation, decide which ones mean something completely different than the word means, then there's no agreement upon when or how many times it is described. And even if it is, we wouldn't know what it's actually referencing if nobody had taught us these extra biblical ideas of what hell should be, because there are no horns, there is no red skin, there is no pitchfork, there is no hoofed feet, there is no worms outside of the grave, there is no fire in an afterlife world that is ongoing on regenerative skin. I do think there are some references to a refining fire later, but there's definitely references to a refining fire here on earth. And even if I were going to use the word hell, okay, just throw it around, okay, not even using what these words mean, but just applying it where I want to, I would definitely say I believe in hell on earth, okay? I believe in weeping and gnashing of teeth on earth. I believe addictions can bring us into hell. I believe that real sin, like real trespasses against other human beings, can create a hell on earth, okay? It's not going to create regenerative skin. It's not going to create worms eating you on earth. It's not going to create any of this stuff, right? And so it's not Hades, but it is something that we can say like hell on earth, okay? And a lot of what actually is being taught about torment and waiting on Jesus and all this kind of stuff, that is hell on earth, even though that's not necessarily called out by the word hell or Hades. But the torment is very much called out, that we are tormented when we operate in our own self-righteousness, when we go our own way, operate according to our own understanding, and that produces torment. It creates torture. It creates a weeping and gnashing of teeth, and all of those things that we get delivered from. It's immediate in the sense of that spark has lit a fire of change and growth. But as we grow, we continue to be exposed to new parts of ourselves that still need to experience those fires. And when we talk about the potter's wheel and being smashed on the potter's wheel over and over when things need to get worked out of us, it's a process. I am going on a tangent. So back to this. Example 21. Okay? Actually, example 20. Isaiah 5:11 through 14. Woe unto them that rise up early in the morning, that they may fall a strong drink, that continue until night, till wine inflame them. So we're talking about alcoholism, okay? And we're talking about strong addiction to alcohol. Like you wake up chasing it. Like there is nothing else in your life at this point except alcohol. And the harp and the viol, the tabret, the pipe, the wine are in their feasts, but they regard not the work of the Lord, neither consider the operation of his hands. Therefore my people are gone into captivity, because they have no knowledge, and their honorable men are famished, and their multitude dried up with thirst. That happens with alcoholism, right? Therefore Sheol hath enlarged herself, and opened her mouth without measure, and their glory and their multitude and their pomp, and he rejoiceth shall descend into it. Now you'll notice every time the word Sheol is used, it's always a descent, never an ascent. Okay? The grave is always a descent, right? Never an ascent. So this is talking about how alcoholism is increasing the size of the graveyards, right? It is leading people to an early grave. And that is what alcoholism will do to people, is it will bring an increase of death, an increase of bad health, okay, of increased thirst that this talks about. We've seen like the licking the lips constantly with an alcoholic, all of these kinds of things, right? So drinking is an epidemic in this passage that is causing a death toll to grow. Okay? So example 21, Isaiah 21:4 through 19. That thou shalt take up this proverb against the king of Babylon, and say, how hath the oppressor ceased, the golden city ceased. The Lord has broken the staff of the wicked and the scepter of the rulers. He who smote the people in wrath with a continual stroke, he that ruled the nations in anger, and persecuted and none hindereth. The whole earth is at rest and is quiet. They break forth into singing. Yea, the fir trees rejoice at thee, and the cedars of Lebanon, saying, since thou art laid down, no feller is come up against us. Sheol from beneath, as again, we're going down, from beneath, is moved for thee to meet thee at thy coming. It stirreth up the dead for you. Even all the chief ones of the earth, it's raised up from their thrones all the kings of the nations. So every king, all the chief ones in the earth, are in this place that got interpreted to hell in some passages. And not every king was evil. Not every king went to hell. Not every chief, not every great person on earth. That said, from underneath the grave will expose and bring up all of the dead. That's not like all the bad people. It's good and bad people combined. It's just people, dead people who were in the ground. Okay, and they shall speak and say to you, art thou also become weak as we? Art thou become like unto us? Thy pomp is brought down to the grave. Okay, there's the word grave, and it actually is interpreted grave. And the noise of thy vials, the worm is spread under thee, and the worms cover thee. So again, we have the reference to worms, okay? This is worms that eat you in the ground. How thou art fallen from heaven, O Lucifer, which means light bearer, son of the morning, how art thou cut down to the ground, which didst weaken the nations? Okay, this is a prophecy against the king of Babylon. All right. Now, the word Lucifer, meaning light bearer, is the same as bright and morning star, which is interpreted as Lucifer in the Old Testament, and in the New Testament, Jesus is identified as the bright and morning star. So, and he is, they are, this, anyway, I don't want to go too far down that road, but anyway, this is a prophecy against the king of Babylon. For thou hast said in thine heart, I will ascend into heaven, I will exalt my throne above the stars of God. I will sit also upon the mount of the congregation in the sides of the north. I will ascend above the heights of the clouds, I will be like the Most High. Yet thou shalt be brought down to hell, or in this case, Sheol, okay? To the sides of the pit, okay? So, you wanted to ascend above God, all right? We have the Tower of Babel and all that, and this idea or concept that going up is to get to God, all right? So that's being used in this metaphor. And he's like, you're trying to go high, so instead, God is going to bring you low, okay? And he's going to bring you so low into the grave, you're going to have worms underneath you, you're going to have worms on top of you, and you're going to be stuck to the sides of the pit, okay? That is not afterlife. Getting stuck to the sides of the pit, that is morbid and gross, and it's about death, okay? They that see thee shall narrowly look upon thee and consider thee, saying, is this the man that made the earth to tremble, that did shake kingdoms, that made the world his wilderness, and destroyed the cities thereof, that opened not the house of his prisoners? All the kings of the nations, even all of them, lie in glory, every one in his own house. Okay, so that's kings of nations, again, lie in glory, which just a little bit ago, in the same passage, we talked about how all of them were in Sheol. Okay, not hell, but the grave. All right? And in his own house is like their own sepulchers or their own like tombs, okay? So, but thou art cast out of thy grave like an abominable branch. So I'll bring you down to the pit, worms will eat you, you'll be stuck to the sides of the pit, and then the pit is going to reject you because you're not even worth the grave, okay? So you're cast out of the grave like an abominable branch, and as a remnant of those that are slain, thrust through with a sword, that go down to the stones of the pit, as a carcass trodden under feet. So, carcass, stones of the pit, slain, thrust through with a sword, stuck to the sides of the pit, worms eating you in the pit. This is all about death. You know, without breaking down every single part of what this passage is talking about, because this is a deep, deep passage as far as symbolism and prophecy and a lot of things that are going on in this passage. But keeping it in context to what it's talking about, it is clearly talking about the grave and not afterlife. Because Jesus does call himself the bright morning star in Revelation 22:16. The word Lucifer occurs once in the Bible. It means light bringer. This passage is the only place that name is ever mentioned. It's believed that the word Lucifer is a reference to Satan, due to the fact that this passage says there was a star that fell from heaven. So again, like, we're coming from all these preconceived notions. Like, we believe that from these New Testament ideas, that when we come back to this prophecy, that the matching up of the two will further embolden a teaching that really is outside of the two, that we think brings the two together more cohesively. But it's still an outside teaching. where this is clearly talking about the stones of the pit being stuck to the side of the grave, being eaten by worms, being rejected by the grave, having your carcass trodden underfoot, and having the carcass trodden underfoot. I mean, this is not afterlife, okay? Your carcass being trodden underfoot and the grave rejecting you and spitting you out, like, none of that really, like, goes along with our hell teaching, okay? You don't go down to hell and get spit out by hell and then your carcass gets trampled, all right? After you were stuck to the sides of hell because the worms ate you. Like, none of that's regenerative skin, right? And definitely, if this Lucifer was Satan, which this is the only time Lucifer is mentioned and it's not Satan, even if it was, then we would be saying that, one, Satan doesn't rule hell, which a lot of people who believe in hell would probably go along with that. But the older teaching, he definitely was in charge of hell. Which begs the question of who is in charge of hell. But hell cannot reject somebody to the point that their carcass is spit out on earth and trampled by men, okay? Your carcass doesn't get spit out of afterlife onto the earth from being stuck to the side of hell. Like, none of that works. But it does work if the grave itself rejects you and spits you up and your carcass gets trampled on, okay? And all these things are about the king of Babylon with a double entendre of prophetic symbolism towards some future events. So the stars of God, and if we want to go into the symbolism, you know, the stars of God are the kings of the royal line of David. Numbers 24:17 will back that up. From David onward, these stars ruled from Mount Zion. After Solomon built the temple in Jerusalem, the name Zion came to apply to the whole city. Under the law, covenant, all male Israelites were obliged to travel to Zion 3 times a year. Thus it became the mountain of meeting. By determining to subjugate the Judean kings and then remove them from that mountain, Nebuchadnezzar is declaring his intention to put himself above those stars. Instead of giving God credit for the victory over them, he arrogantly puts himself in God's place. So it is after being cut down to the earth that the Babylonian dynasty is mockingly referred to as the Shining One. I can go more in depth on that, but I think it's better, due to time and the length of this, to really try to stick to our reasoning for why hell or Hades does not exist, okay? So example 22, Isaiah 28:14 through 20. Wherefore, hear the word of the Lord, ye scornful men that rule the people which is in Jerusalem. Because ye have said, we have made a covenant with death, and with Sheol are we at agreement. When the overflowing scourge shall pass through, it shall not come unto us. For we have made lies our refuge, and under falsehood have we hid ourselves. Therefore thus saith the Lord God, behold, I lay in Zion for a foundation, a stone, a tried stone, a precious cornerstone, a sure foundation. He that believeth shall not make haste. Judgment also will I lay to the line, and righteousness to the plummet, and the hail shall sweep away the refuge of lies, and the water shall overflow the hiding place. And your covenant with death shall be disannulled, and your agreement with Sheol shall not stand. When the overflowing scourge shall pass through, then ye shall be trodden down by it. From the time that it goeth forth, it shall take you. From morning by morning shall it pass over, by day and by night, and it shall be a vexation only to understand the report. For the bed is shorter than that a man can stretch himself on it, and the covering narrower than that he can wrap himself in it. So, Maveth was the word for violent death, and then Sheol was the word for grave throughout this passage, okay? So, we've made a covenant with a violent death, and with the grave, okay? So, when we talk about, like, the bed, a man can't stretch himself out on it, the covering is narrower, that he can wrap himself up in it. You know, we're talking about a grave that is not even dug properly. These men had not made arrangements with God's everlasting wrath, right? They were essentially making an insurance policy, thinking they were protected from death, but God is going to bring disaster on them from everywhere so they can't escape it, and they're going to be buried in a grave that's too small for them and doesn't do a good job of covering them at all. So basically they're going to be in these shallow graves, partially exposed on the earth, and then you get into all the worms and all that stuff that isn't even described here, but we know worms are going to eat them. So example 23, Isaiah 57:9. And thou wentest to the king with ointment, and didst increase thy perfumes, and didst send thy messengers far off, and didst debase thyself, even unto Sheol. Okay, so the passage probably needs to be read in its entirety. It's talking about worship of other gods, and if I didn't give you the passage, that's Isaiah 57. So it's talking about worship of other gods through sex and idolatry. It talks about seeking other things or objects to worship, or worship with, or how they search the entire earth for anything new because they are never satisfied, and they would search even as far as to dig up a grave and find a new way to worship through sex or idolatry. So kind of gross, but this is where we're talking about digging up bodies and having sex with them. So example 24, Ezekiel 31:15 through 18. Thus saith the Lord God, in the day when he went down to the grave, or Sheol, okay, I caused a mourning. I covered the deep for him, and I restrained the floods, and the great waters were stayed, and I caused Lebanon to mourn for him, and all the trees of the field fainted for him. I made the nations to shake at the sound of his fall, when I sent him down to Sheol. With them that descend into the pit, and all the trees of Eden, and the choice and best of Lebanon, all that drink water, shall be comforted in the nether parts of the earth. They also went down into Sheol with him unto them that be slain with the sword, and they that were in his arm, that were his arm, that dwelt under the shadow in the midst of the heathen. To whom art thou thus like in glory and in greatness among the trees of Eden? Yet shalt thou be brought down with the trees of Eden unto the nether parts of the earth. Thou shalt lie in the midst of the uncircumcised, with them that be slain by the sword. This is Pharaoh and his multitude, saith the Lord God. So we have the trees of Lebanon, we have the trees of Eden, which would also, I guess, include the tree of life and the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. All of these things are being brought into the nether parts of the earth, okay? So it says, I made the nations to shake at the sound of his fall, when I cast him down to Sheol, and with them that descend into the pit, and all the trees of Eden, all the choice and best of Lebanon, all that drink water. So everything, you basically have this entire thing, including people and things, like being swallowed up and hidden inside the earth, including Eden, which is extremely interesting when we think about it. Okay, and we know that Eden and the tree of life is not in Hades, right? We know that all those that drink water are not in Hades. We know that the choice and best of Lebanon are not in Hades, okay? And that's talking about trees. Like, trees are not going to hell. Agreed? Hopefully. We know that trees do not go to hell. Trees don't face a judgment. They don't burn forever. They aren't eaten by worms and regenerative bark. Like, this is about the grave. And in this case, it's the grave in the sense of the earth is swallowing it up. But there's a lot more happening here than just a grave. You have all sorts of stuff going into this pit, or into this swallowing of the earth, this sinkhole kind of. And it reminds me of Atlantis, you know. And it talks about Pharaoh, like how he was swallowed by the sea, or covered by the sea. And like, there's so much in this passage, so much. But it is very, very, very clear that we are not talking about afterlife. We are not talking about eternal torment. And we don't have any picture of Hades. So, example 25, Ezekiel 32:20 through 30. We are almost done with the Old Testament, people. Where have we seen a clear teaching on what hell is? Where have we seen a distinction of when we're talking about hell versus when we're talking about the grave? Where have we seen a very clear concept of who's going to go there and whether it's good or bad? Where have we seen a warning to the wicked that they're going to spend eternity here? None of that, and let's start preaching to trees if trees are going to go to hell, right? But we know that that's not the case, and if it is, then we've got a whole new hell teaching, okay? And everything that we've pulled out so far, if we were to start building hell around it, we have everyone going there. We have everyone rich going there. We have babies going there. We have old people going there. We have men, women, children. We have snakes. We have arrows. We have an inside and an outside, so maybe rings of hell. You have boneyards. You have thirst. That aligns with the mainstream teaching. You have famine. And you have swords. I think I already said arrows. You have wild beasts. And that's it. So no sulfur, no fire and brimstone, no mention of being tormented or tortured. No mention of worms eating regenerative flesh, although we have plenty of references to worms. So it's very hard. Like, without the teaching that's outside the Bible coming back into the Bible, you cannot get there. Okay? You won't find it. It doesn't exist. So I'm not done. I'm talking like I'm already done with the Old Testament, but we're almost at the end. Okay? So Ezekiel 32, 20 through 30. They shall fall in the midst of them that are slain by the sword. She is delivered to the sword. Draw her in all her multitudes. The strong among the mighty shall speak to him out of the midst of Sheol. With them that help them, they are gone down. They lie uncircumcised, slain by the sword. So they lie, slain by the sword. In hell, in Sheol, in the grave. I want to do that whole passage too, but it's long. The entire passage is about graves, sepulchers, being buried. It's all about death, all about laying down among the dead. So example 26, Amos 9:2. Though they dig into Sheol, thence shall mine hand take them. Though they climb up to heaven, thence will I bring them down. Okay? Though they dig into the grave, my hand will take them, and if they try to climb up to heaven, I will bring them down. So you can't escape God, essentially, is what it's saying. Okay? So Jonah 2, 1 through 3. Then Jonah prayed unto the Lord his God out of the fish's belly, and said, I cry by reason of mine affliction unto the Lord, and he heard me. Out of the belly of Sheol cried I, and thou heardest my voice. For thou hast cast me into the deep, into the midst of the seas, and the floods compassed me about. All thy billows and all thy waves passed over me. Now, Jonah was not literally buried in the earth. We know that, right? Yet there really isn't a word for being buried in a fish, okay? But we're still talking about a grave. We're still talking about being covered. We're still talking about a tomb in a place where Jonah was going to die. This was his tomb. This was his grave, right? And so that's why I'm saying it means to be covered. It doesn't necessarily always mean dirt, but the common interpretation is to be buried in a grave. But if we use the word grave here, it definitely fits. That was a tomb. You know, that fish's belly was a tomb. Okay, whatever that fish was not a whale. Just side note. Whales can't eat people. Example 28. This is the last time the word Sheol is used in the Old Testament. Okay? And that's Habakkuk 2, 5 through 8. And you'll notice there's whole books here where it's never interpreted as hell ever, and the word Sheol isn't even used. So, anyway, Habakkuk 2. People have weird ways of pronouncing Habakkuk too. Some people make it sound like the word tobacco, like Habakkuk. So I don't know the right pronunciation. I like Habakkuk, but I hear a lot of people say Habakkuk. So 2:5-8. Yea, also, because he transgresseth by wine, he is a proud man, neither keepeth at home, who enlargeth his desire as Sheol, and is as death, Maveth again, and cannot be satisfied, but gathereth unto him all nations, and heapeth unto him all people. Shall not all these take up a parable against him, and a taunting proverb against him, and say, Woe to him that increaseth, which is not his, how long? And to him that ladeth himself with thick clay. Shall they not rise up suddenly that shall bite thee, and awake that shall vex thee, and thou shalt be for booty unto them? Because thou hast spoiled many nations, all the remnant of the people shall spoil thee because of men's blood, and for the violence of the land, of the city, and of all that dwell therein. Through violence and theft and drinking and power, the desire for power is growing as rapidly as the grave. Okay? So that's everything. Okay? That's the word Sheol throughout the entirety of the Old Testament. So usage of the word hell in the Bible. Okay, so and we're talking about the word Sheol, okay? 31 times from the Hebrew word Sheol, which means grave. Okay, in the New Testament, which we're not into just yet, make another one of these for that. 10 times from the Greek word Hades, okay? Because the word Hades replaced Sheol because they were in captivity to a place where the Greek language was being used and the New Testament was written in Greek, okay? And Jesus made fun of Greek concepts a lot, and Jesus went really overboard in a lot of the things he said because he got really irritated with people and tended to be very over the top, and the term is called hyperbole. We'll get into that. So 10 times from the Greek Hades, which means the grave. 12 times the word Gehenna, which is a whole nother thing we'll get into. Gehenna was a literal place on earth where bodies were essentially cremated, like the dead were thrown over the side of a cliff in this one spot. It was basically a big trash heap of corpses, and they burned it periodically, and so the fires were always going. And there are a lot of references to, well, not a lot, there's a few references to Gehenna, and because we have bodies being, or souls being constantly thrown into this crematorium, where the fires never really die down, we get a lot more of our imagery from these very few passages that we try to use to justify this afterlife teaching of Hades. And because it was similar to what the Greeks were teaching about Hades and the word being used, Hades, there's a lot of correlation. I'm getting ahead of myself. I'm going to go more in depth. That is very loosely just thrown out there right now. We'll go more in depth here in a bit. But anyway, so that word Gehenna is 12 times total. And remember, we have 4 Gospels that repeat themselves, okay? So 12 times total. That's 7 times in Matt, 3 times in Mark, okay? And it's in the same passage. 1 time in Luke, okay? And that's all Gospels recording the same event. And then 1 time by James, okay? And he uses it talking about the power of the... Anyway, I'm getting ahead of myself. So, Gehenna, it's the grave by cremation for the body of criminals on earth. They were not afforded the right of burial. And also, in fairness, a word used for something that started getting taught in 600 BC, which is a whole nother thing. There's one time the Greek word Tartarus is used that also has gotten interpreted into the word hell in some translations, which means a place of darkness, especially prepared for angels that have sinned. And that's where we get our outer darkness concept. And some people built their entire belief about hell in an afterlife around the idea of outer darkness or Tartarus. It was used once within the entire Bible, so it is interesting to build something so elaborate off of one word being interpreted to this word that we have used several different words. In the Old Testament, we used one word consistently, which was Sheol, to sometimes say that was talking about hell. In the New Testament, we used 3 different words to sometimes say that they meant hell, with the same inconsistency from translation to translation. So let's just go through a couple of the concepts before we wrap up the Old Testament, okay? So Adam and Eve in the garden. When God placed Adam and Eve in the garden, he never mentioned the concept of eternal torment to them, okay? It is, and again, I'm trying not to be inflammatory, but do you think it is strange that as human history began on this planet, and while God is explaining which tree they could not eat of, that he didn't give the parents of all mankind some kind of warning about eternal punishment? Okay? Because it seems like it was so important to not eat from that tree, right? And he did say, in that day you will die. But he did not warn them about anything we talk about when we talk about hell. He didn't warn them about eternal torment. He didn't warn them about fire. He didn't warn them about ongoing torture, worms, regenerative skin, none of that, right? And death, by virtue, eliminated the idea of living forever and being fed off of by worms, or living forever and being tortured, because they would have had to eat the tree of life in order to live forever in the first place, right? And again, I'm reading from some things that I've written in the past, so I hope it doesn't come across sounding too mechanical. So most of us think eternal torment will engulf the vast majority of mankind, nearly all of Adam and Eve's descendants. Yet here's a Father God who didn't warn his children of the potential of what might befall them. What would you think of a father who told his young children not to ride his bike in the street, and if he did, he would get a spanking? Suppose that he also, this parent, okay, so, sorry, I had to catch up to what I wrote. So you warn your kid, don't take your bike in the street, it's dangerous, right? But when your kid does it, or before he does it, you start a fire at home, or you start some elaborate torture process for your kid. So when your kid goes in the street and does the thing that you warned them about, not because you were trying to give them crazy rules, you warned them because, and not because you were trying to give them a religion or a mission, you warned them because you know they could get hurt in the street, right? And you're trying to keep them from being hurt. So if you are going to hurt them beyond anything they could have experienced in the street, and your punishment is going to be so excessive to what you were trying to prevent in the first place out of love, then is it love to torture or abuse that child when it comes home because it disobeyed you and went into the street? No, there should be consequences, yes, but those consequences are love, right? The consequences are to be effective in keeping that child safe. They are meant to be effective in keeping that child from getting hurt. It is not meant to be ongoing, everlasting, worse than anything they could have experienced by what you were warning them about to begin with, right? It just doesn't make sense. And I'm not saying you're a bad person if you still believe in it. I'm just reasoning here, okay? So yet to Adam and Eve, the father of all mankind, allegedly, would have failed to mention a much greater punishment than the death they would die the day they ate of the forbidden tree. Was it a slip of the mind on God's part to not mention at all that terrible woes that lay ahead for the vast majority of their descendants? No, God announced to them a tangible, present punishment the very day they committed the sin. In the day thou eatest thereof, you shall surely die. And they found that the wages of sin was death, okay? Because death entered the world at the fall, okay? And it wasn't afterlife, it wasn't Hades. Hades didn't appear, you know? It didn't come into the picture. So then we go on to Cain and Abel, right? So, same's true with Cain and Abel, a case of murder of a brother. So surely we would think that God might roll out the threat of eternal torment that Cain was to receive as a warning to all future generations. But in the whole account, there's not a hint, not a single word on the subject. Instead, Cain's told, and now art thou cursed from the earth, right? When thou tillest the ground, it shall not henceforth yield unto thee her strength. A fugitive and a vagabond shall thou be in the earth. Okay, again, earth, in the earth, in the earth. Again, Cain received an immediate, tangible, physical punishment administered with absolutely no warning of future eternal torment. Like Adam, Cain heard none of the dire warnings preached from pulpits of the fiery wrath of God tormenting his soul through eternity. So God has not warned Adam and Eve. He has not warned Cain. Okay? Nor do we have any record of Cain going there. In fact, God protected Cain. He gave him a mark saying, I will avenge you if somebody punishes you in my behalf, which is a whole nother thing that's interesting to look at. So, Noah and the flood. I'm skipping over a bunch of what I wrote there. When we come to Noah and the flood, God noted that every thought of man's heart was only evil continually, right? That the earth was filled with violence. All flesh had corrupted his way upon the earth. So this would have been the ideal time to start preaching about hell, right? He should have revealed eternal torment here. But he doesn't. He warns them of a flood. He warns them about death in the earth. So they're destroyed by the flood. Again, a physical, tangible punishment for their sin. No warning of eternal torment. And there was no warning about it when mankind inhabited the earth again after the flood. And if we wanted to rule by fear of hell, it would have been a prime time to roll this out. Plus, you may have had more consistency throughout other world religions if it had had a root instead of appearing in later religion. Okay? So Sodom and Gomorrah, right? A rape culture. This is like the most hated culture in history according to the Bible. Okay? God pretty much just nuked this city, and more so. And it was hated because they were obsessed with rape. It was not a homosexual culture, just throwing that in there. I mean, there was homosexuality practiced within the culture, but it was a rape culture. So the rape was what God was judging. Lot would not offer homosexual men his daughters if he knew they were only interested in men, right? He offers his daughters to them because they're obsessed with sex, period. They're obsessed with rape. They're obsessed with taking women, putting them on these beds in the street that were built and open, and they would gang rape these people. Women, men, children. It didn't matter. That they were so obsessed with sex and with forcing people into sex that the culture was so damaged and so corrupt. And I can go way further into all of that, but I always want to throw in that this was not judged for homosexuality. They were judged for rape, which is a situation that the church is not paying enough attention to, in my humble opinion. And back to hell, okay? So, Sodom and Gomorrah. Physical destruction of the cities and their inhabitants without even a rumor of endless future torment that we would probably assume, based on our preconceived notions, that they unknowingly faced. So what would we think if our government passed a new law with a huge fine as the punishment? But when a guilty party was found, he paid the fine, but also had to serve endless torment that the citizens had no warning of. What kind of judge explains the law and known penalty while carefully concealing a much more awful penalty? What would the penalty of a few $1,000s matter in a case where he was also going to be tormented horribly and endlessly? Yet, our popular concept is that the Sodomites were sent into such a judgment. Okay? So we can go through the accounts of the builders of the Tower of Babel, the destruction of Pharaoh and his armies, Lot's wife, and we would notice the same thing, that never is afterlife torment mentioned, okay? All these received a temporal physical punishment with no mention of an infinitely greater torturous punishment awaiting them in the future. So, was this teaching deliberately excluded from the record, or did it never belong? I'll say that again. Was this Hades hell teaching deliberately, intentionally excluded from the records of the scriptures we have, or did it never belong in the first place? We know that it isn't there. Neither the word Gehenna nor the concept of endless torment was given in the millennia before the giving of the law of Moses. From the creation to Mount Sinai, there's simply no insinuation of it in the entirety of human history up to that time. By the conclusion of this study, I believe that we're going to see that God never had a plan of inflicting such dreadful torment on the people of his own creation. Okay? So, Mosaic Law. Most of us are familiar with the blessings and cursings Moses pronounced upon the Israelites in Deuteronomy 28 through 30 before they ever entered the promised land. If the Jews were disobedient to God, he promised them every conceivable punishment. Excuse me. He would curse their children. These are the punishments listed like in black and white. We have it, okay? It's written in the law. The law is very thorough, right? The law of Moses. God gave us 10 commandments. Moses gave us 613 laws in behalf of God to make us closer somehow to the original 10 that God actually gave us. Which is why Moses is called the accuser of the brethren by Jesus in Matthew. That's not the devil, that's Moses, it's the law. Okay? Anyway, the punishments listed in the law. If the Jews were disobedient to God, he promised them every conceivable punishment. So he would curse their children. That was one of the punishments. He'd curse their crops. He cursed their flocks. He cursed their health. He cursed the health of their children. He cursed the welfare of the nation. He foretold that they would go into captivity. He would issue such horrible temporal physical judgments that it would drive them to eat their own children. So among such an extensive list of punishments that would come upon his disobedient people, this is all Old Testament, okay? And apologetics could come towards a lot of that stuff. But just the point that I'm trying to make right now, without going too deep into all of that other stuff, is that God did not utter even a whisper of endless torment upon them in any case of rebellion, even when it came down to eating their own children, right? So all these physical temporal judgments would take place in this life every time. We could multiply such cases of temporal punishments for rebellion, corruption, and idolatry under Moses. He spelled them out in detail. So the writer of Hebrews, I'm skipping ahead. I don't know if I want to skip ahead there, but I will a little bit. Okay, so the word spoken through angels, the Mosaic law, proved steadfast, and every transgression and disobedience received a just recompense of reward. Okay, so that right there eliminates the idea of excessive punishment. So as we've seen, the punishment was physical and temporal with no promise of endless torment whatsoever, ever. Okay, endless torment was simply unknown under the law of Moses. The question now arises, did every transgressor and disobedient Jewish or Israelite receive just punishment or not? If they did, will their punishment continue to be just if in the future they will also receive endless torment in a hell or Hades that they were never told of and knew nothing of? Because they don't know anything about it, right? If so, will eternal torment on top of their just physical temporal punishment still be just? It can't be, can it? How can adding infinite torture in the future that they knew nothing of to an already just punishment they received in the past on earth under the Old Testament still be just? So in summary, for these first three parts, where we are on just the Old Testament, okay, knowing that the New Testament is not going to bring new teachings, okay, it's going to bring fulfillment, right? Jesus came to fulfill, not to add to. So in summary, the popular concept of hell is not found anywhere in the Old Testament. Prove me wrong, okay? The word Gehenna is not even contained in the Greek Old Testament, because it didn't exist at that time. Endless torment is nowhere to be found in the pages of the Torah or the Pentateuch. So what happened is we had 14th century interpreters who were already part of the indulgence movement, who were a part of a society that was selling indulgences to get out of hell, where the idea of hell was created out of the Greek concept of Hades, including 9 rings of hell, and this was laid out with all sorts of monsters that look like demons that we would talk about today, and devils and all of this kind of stuff, fire, and all these places within hell and conversations in hell, within 2 plays, which was Milton's Paradise Lost and Dante's Inferno. Okay, it was meant to drive fear that would cause people to convert, to hold power over them, and to prosper at their expense. So I know it's still going to be a head game for a lot of people to figure out what the New Testament is talking about in certain places. But if it was never taught and never talked about in the Old Testament, and I will go through the New Testament stuff, but because otherwise you're going to be very stuck. But you have to know that we're already wrong if we're assuming it's true in the New Testament, because the Old Testament, it's not there. It's not there at all. And I don't know how many times I can say that. I'm repeating that over and over and over. But we have just gone through every single passage that uses the word Sheol, whether it was interpreted as hell or interpreted as the grave. And we didn't find it. We did not find a clear teaching. Deuteronomy was the closest we could possibly get, and it is still so far away and clearly talking about things in the earth. So I'm going to leave you with that. I'm going to come back, and when I come back, we're going to do a teaching on the New Testament part of this. So until then, have a good day.